Let's have a deep look at the Spectrum, the updated version of the popular Sinclair ZX Spectrum released by RetroGames. I'm going to go over all that it can do, what's special about it, and who I think this device is for. I have chapters for everything in the video, so feel free to jump around if something is particularly interesting to you. There's a lot to cover, so let's get started. I know almost a third of my audience is from the US, so the ZX Spectrum is probably totally new to you. Stick with me anyway, because it may be a fantastic introduction to the machine. For all of you in Europe and Australia, you probably already know all about the Sinclair ZX Spectrum. The one-sentence summary is that the ZX Spectrum was an early and very cheap microcomputer that became wildly popular in many countries. And yes, there were cheaper computers like the ZX80, for example, and there were more powerful computers like the Commodore 64, I admit that, but the Spectrum managed to hit the perfect balance of price and power and spread like wildfire. I personally didn't own one as a kid, but I knew quite a few people who did, so I was definitely immersed in that culture. And I think one of the reasons the ZX Spectrum was so popular is the way it looks. It's so small, sleek, and inviting. And remember, this was back in 1982, and most people had never heard of a home computer, and this is really a truly iconic design. Today's updated version, named the Spectrum, manages to reproduce the look of the original perfectly. The keyboard layout is identical and they feel pretty much spot on. Those aren't really pluses though, since the keyboard was notorious for having a weird layout. Look, there's no space key in the center, and having rubbery keys, but it's definitely like the original. The back is where things really change. The original had no power button, an RF signal video out, and some extension slots. It didn't even have a joystick port. The Spectrum, on the other hand, has a power button, a USB-C socket to power it, good choice, an HDMI video out, several USB connectors for media and controllers, and a home button for some special functions we'll see later on. I'm already liking this. I should also mention that it came in this very nice box, and it's very neatly packaged in a way that you can store it away when you're done with it. It definitely feels like a premium Apple product. It also comes with this printed quick start guide that uses a very similar cover to the original manual, but not quite the same. Actually, it was full at first. On their website, you can find a full user manual describing all the functionality of the device, as well as all the games included with key mappings and all of that, which is pretty amazing. Anyway, enough of that, and let's fire it up. When you turn it on, you start in what they call the carousel mode. If you've ever used an NES Mini or a Super Nintendo Mini, this is exactly the same. It comes with 48 games pre-installed. I'm sure that number wasn't a coincidence. Well played. You can scroll around, and for each of them, you can see a quick description, and you can even get some extra help with the key mappings. There's actually a lot more info than I had as a kid playing some of those games with tapes of questionable origin. The only negative thing about this is that nowhere in the carousel info or in the full user manual in RetroGames website is there any information about the creators of the games or the company. Nothing at all. That will be a really easy fix for a future update, RetroGames. Just saying. But the games, oh boy. Let me tell you about the game selection. Clearly they had to license those games, so they couldn't just get anything. But they managed to land some major titles like Manic Miner or Head Over Heels. But even beyond that, whoever picked that list had really good tastes, or at least taste very similar to mine, because there are some great titles. Some of my favorites are The Great Escape, Highway Encounter, School Days, Exelon, Firelord, Saboteur, and a special mention to Fantis, also known as Game Over 2, because it was made by Carlos Abril, a good friend of mine. Only downside is the total lack of Ultimate games. I get it was probably a licensing nightmare since I think those rights are owned by Nintendo right now, but we'll deal with that in a little bit. I'm definitely not having a Spectrum machine without being able to run Nightlore or Saberwolf. To play a game, you just scroll your way to it or mark it as favorite ahead of time, press the key, and you're there. It loads instantly. But wait, you may be saying. Most Spectrum games came in tapes, and it usually took anywhere between 5 and 20 minutes to load. Yes, that's right. These games all load pretty much instantaneously. Does that mean you don't have the tape loading experience? No, actually. But we'll cover that in a few minutes. Let's check the game first. By the way, the Spectrum device runs at 50 Hz to be perfectly accurate with the original Spectrum. Although it has a 60 Hz mode if your display doesn't support it, which I think most of them support it these days. But anyway, that means that the video capture that I'm showing here is sometimes a little bit glitchy or choppy in a few places. You can ignore that, and trust me when I say that it totally looks like the regular Spectrum. That's just an artifact of the capture. Since you're using the real keyboard layout, playing games works exactly as intended. Obviously, this is emulated and not a real Spectrum hardware, but it feels great. Just like the real thing. I actually turned on a CRT filter globally to add some scout lines. No, it's not perfect, but it actually looks much better than the sharp pixels it renders by default. And no, games didn't have perfect edges back then, but actually that's a whole video that I have to make sometime. Just like you could do with the NES Mini, while you're playing a game, you can press the home button, that's that button in the back right that I talked about earlier, and that brings you back to the carousel. There you can save the game state for later. You have 4 slots and you can save and load. And that alone is a huge improvement over the real Spectrum. There were no saves at all in the Spectrum games, so this is a huge quality of life improvement. Okay, so maybe that was expected if you were using a NES Mini, but here's another improvement that I wasn't expecting at all. You can be in the middle of a game, and since a lot of these games are devilishly difficult, you mistime a jump or you get mobbed by enemies and you press home button and the A button at the same time, and you're presented with a rewind feature. Almost like Braid or Prince of Persia Sense of Time. You can go back at any point in the last 40 seconds and continue playing from there. Is that cheating? Absolutely. But that's exactly what we need today when we want to experience all those games without having to spend months mastering each of them. Besides, that's a lot more fun and fair way to cheat than having infinite lives or even worse, invulnerability and you never die. This feature is awesome. One thing I have glossed over is that when we talk about Sinclair ZX Spectrum, we usually think about this. But really it means this. Later models added better keyboards and later 128K of RAM and an AY sound chip instead of a beeper, and then even a built-in cassette or disk drive. Is the Spectrum only emulating the original Spectrum? Not at all. The Spectrum has the ability to emulate most of those models, so it can run just about the full catalog of Spectrum games. That's how they managed to have a really nice mix of older games from the beginning of the Spectrum life, like Horace Goes Skiing and Manic Miner, and you can tell by the simple graphics and the beeper sound, and some from a later period of the Spectrum, like Target Renegade from 1988. Those have 128K tag in the carousel, and it's pretty obvious when you run them with the much improved AY music. Interestingly, I couldn't find any games that were released towards the end of the commercial life of the Spectrum, like around 1989 or later. Those games usually had a jump up in quality because of multi-load sequences from tape or even taking advantage of disk support. But to make up for that, there are several modern homebrew games made in the last 10 years, so it really gives you quite a variety of games. By the way, I should add that this video is not sponsored by RetroGames. I actually approached them about reviewing the Spectrum and they sent me a copy free of charge, but they have no input whatsoever on what I say in this video. PCBWay, on the other hand, are the sponsors of today's video. I am very grateful to them for continuing to support the channel and make all of this possible. If you haven't used them before, PCBWay offer PCB manufacturing in small amounts, so you can iterate during development of board ideas or even do small batches of a final product. They also offer a bunch of other very interesting services like 3D printing or CNC manufacturing. If you're interested in that, definitely check out their website at PCBWay.com. Okay, so we have 48 games. What else can we do with this? Pretty much the same things as you could with a regular ZX Spectrum. The most obvious thing is to add your own games. Unlike the NES Mini, you don't need to hack the Spectrum. It already comes pre-hacked for you. So just load whatever games you want in a USB stick, and it supports about every format out there. TAP, TZX, Snap, and all of that. Pop it in one of the USB slots in the back and go over to the media entry. There you can browse the directory structure, select the game you want, and just launch it automatically. That easy. If you've used a device like the div MMC on a real Spectrum, this will sound very familiar to you. It's the same thing, just an even easier UI to navigate. Since now we're running our own games, we need to decide what Spectrum model they run in. By default, it will be the base 48K model, but you can set that to 128K or the Plus 2, along with a few other program-specific settings, which all get saved to the USB drive for future use. And by the way, you can still save, load, and rewind the game state, just like you could with the pre-installed games, which is great. You could say that I'm a fan of ultimate games. So one of the first things I tried to do was to run Night Lore in Saber Wolf. Just like with any other game, you select the file, load it, and it runs. Yay! Except that it crashes right after the menu. Does that sound familiar? That's exactly what happens when you try to load older Ultimate titles on a ZX Spectrum with more than 48K. I remember there was some kind of weird incompatibility that caused that crash, except that here they're supposedly running in 48K mode. That's weird, right? So let's try the same fix that would work on a Spectrum, which is this particular poke. Run it again. Ha! And now it works. So it looks like the 48K emulation doesn't quite behave exactly as a base 48K Spectrum. Now, this is a really very minor thing, and maybe it's something that can be fixed in the future. Earlier I said that most Spectrum games originally came in cassette tapes. So what if you want to have the original experience loading them with the old-fashioned way? Sure, games took forever to load, but really it was a different experience. The crazy borderlines, the digital sounds, the loading screens, and sometimes loading sequences that were pretty creative with like a countdown timer or some animated screens. The Spectrum got you covered. Instead of just using a tap file, use a file that represents the real tape data, like a TZX one. Those are the ones that we used in the video for the TZX Duino actually. The process is the same as for other formats. Select it in the media browser, auto-load it, and there you go. Lots of borderline and BP goodness. Everybody needs to load a game this way. And the best thing is that you will not be getting any errors like you did with physical tapes. There's actually even a cool cassette tape browser built in by pressing Home and A that lets you view the tape content and the different blocks. Very, very cool. Did I mention that someone really thought through the features of the Spectrum? Playing games is only part of it. The other thing that made the original Spectrum wildly successful was that it came with a basic interpreter ready on startup, just like most other home computers at the time. And of course, you can do that with the Spectrum as well. You need to go to System Options and go to what they call Classic Mode. Once you do that, you'll be greeted with a familiar gray screen with a prompt. Now, this is not nearly as friendly as the Commodore 64 BASIC or other BASICs. You're limited to inputting text in the bottom line, and you can move the cursor around, and you can only enter basic keywords through special key combinations, which fortunately are all listed in the keyboard itself. Still, what it lacks in friendliness, it makes up in efficiency. Remember that this was a super budget machine, so I'm sure this is in part to accommodate small ROM sizes. As good as the carousel mode is, this might be where the Spectrum shines the most. Emulators can also have similar front ends that let you pick games quickly, but having a real Spectrum keyboard while working in BASIC is invaluable. See, this is not a normal keyboard. You don't type normally to write basic programs, you don't do print. You press certain keys that bring up certain keywords. So if you want to write print, you press just P, go to G, save, Shift-S, screen, symbol Shift K, which I guess it made sense back in the day since all you had was this horrible rubber keyboard, but it sucks to use it as an emulator with a modern keyboard. You just never remember which key combinations to press, especially as you get into the more obscure ones. ATN is symbol Shift plus E? Really? If they had stopped in there, I wouldn't have complained. But the engineers at RetroGames went the extra mile and implemented a full load and save system from BASIC as well. While in classic mode, you can press the home button and navigate to a file and select it as the current media. Then you can load from BASIC like as usual, and it will load pretty much instantly. You can even save files from BASIC as well, and it will create new files from you, which is awesome. The original ZX Spectrum was so budget that it didn't even come with a joystick connector. Later models did though. But joysticks were huge back then, and even though most of them were really pretty bad, and one of the most common accessories for the ZX Spectrum was actually a joystick adapter. And so much so that there were actually different standards, and that's why you'll often see in menus of games the option to play with different joysticks, a Kempson, Sinclair, or cursor joystick, which is kind of crazy. In any case, the updated ZX Spectrum, you just plug in a joystick or a gamepad in one of the USB ports, and it will emulate a joystick. I'm mostly a keyboard player, but there are some games where a gamepad makes all the difference in the world. For this, I'm using the gamepad from the same company, and I got this with the Amiga a while back. But it seems you can use most USB game controllers, and if not, there are even ways to customize it and maybe get other controllers to work. Finally, I wanted to mention an extra couple cool advanced things the Spectrum supports. In the same way that you can set what kind of Spectrum model, the hardware, the game will run on, you can also turn on the option to enable extended colors. That means that the emulator will emulate a ULAPlus, which is an improved graphic chips that was defined and created in 2008, so relatively recently, and adds new palettes and more color support to the ZX Spectrum. You turn on that option, and any game that supports it will take advantage of it. As a matter of fact, there are a couple games already in the carousel pre-installed that support this. El Stompo and my favorite, Snake Escape. The other advanced feature worth mentioning is that you can even replace the ROMs with your own versions. So that might open the door to emulate clones of the Spectrum like the Invest Spectrum or some of the crazy Eastern European clones. All in all, I continue to be amazed at just how much love went into this machine by someone who was clearly intimately familiar with the Spectrum. And now, because I just can't resist it, let's open it up and see what's inside. So this is pretty much what I expected. It's just like the VIC-20. It's all one small microcontroller, microprocessor, some I/O stuff, and this is just to weigh it down. Interesting. Which makes sense, otherwise it would be like really sliding all over the place. Now I'm also curious about the keyboard, but I can see from this that this is actually using real, well, not real necessarily, it could be reproduction, but it's the same kind of membranes that the original ZX Spectrum is using. Oh, and let's check that out. That's a very nice touch. In memory of Sir Clive Sinclair, 1940-21, and Rick Dickinson. Cool. That's a really nice touch. Oh, so I was hoping to get inside this, but is this glued together? So on the ZX Spectrum, you know what? They might have done the same thing. Normally on a ZX Spectrum, if you want to get to this, you need to pretty much get rid of the glue that is in here. You need to heat this up and remove it. But yeah, so it's exactly the same thing. I'm not gonna do it because I don't want to damage this yet. Sometimes if you're not careful, you can bend this metal a little bit. So it's one thing that if the keyboard wasn't working. But this is really interesting. So I could actually take a real ZX Spectrum and probably just connect it right there and it would work. So very interesting. If you like what you're hearing, where can you get one of those and how much does it cost? For that, you need to go to the website of RetroGames, and there they have a list of where it is available in your country. One warning to North American viewers. They apparently are not distributing it over here, which I think is a huge mistake. So you may have to order it from Amazon in Europe or look on eBay. Or maybe people in a Spectrum group can get together and do a big group buy from Europe or something like that. But other than that, we're out of luck. I was told that the price was going to be £90 or €100, which sounds super reasonable to me for what you get. I have bought Spectrum replacement cases, keyboards, and membranes, and just those things are going to run you close to €100. I would buy it instantly, especially knowing how they've had some supply issues with the VIC-20 a few years ago, so get it while you can. If you're not convinced, but you're curious to learn more about the ZX Spectrum, what are some of the other alternatives? The first one is a Git emulator. They're free, there are lots of different ones, and I always recommend to new users to start with Retro Virtual Machine 2. It's a super user-friendly and it looks fantastic. It won't do any auto-launching of games for you, so you have to do the old load command, but that's actually a good thing and you learn that. Another possibility is to get a real ZX Spectrum. And while that's my preferred option, I get that it's not possible for a lot of people. A plain ZX Spectrum isn't going to be really useful by itself. You're going to need a way to display it, so an adapter for HDMI, or you'll need a monitor that displays either composite, RGB, or RF. Then you'll probably want a device that loads games like a Div MMC or at least a TZX Duino. And then you may want to have different Spectrum models, so you may end up with 2 or 3 or more. And then you need to maintain them, fix their problems as they happen, which I find really fun, but it becomes a hobby all of itself. Another alternative that might be easier for people is to get a Spectrum Modern Recreation. There are open source projects that are a clone of the Spectrum architecture, but already have a lot of those enhancements built in, like RGB out, a Div MMC support, or even Bluetooth or Wi-Fi. Some of the ones I remember are the Harlequin project and the CZIF 512. But of course, you need to be ready to order them and assemble them, debug them if they don't work. Or you can order them assembled by someone, but I have a feeling they're going to be significantly more expensive than the Spectrum, especially if they come with a nice case and a keyboard. If you have a multi-platform FPGA like the Mister, you can definitely experience the ZX Spectrum there, but I've already talked about how I really don't like something like that because you lose completely the physical experience of using it. For that, honestly, I just prefer an emulator without any doubt. And finally, probably the biggest alternative is the ZX Spectrum Next. The ZX Spectrum Next is a project that was launched in 2017 that implements the ZX Spectrum as an FPGA, but it has a very nice custom case and keyboard. The biggest point for that project is that apart from being compatible with the original Spectrum, it also provides enhancements. So that means more RAM, better graphics, and much faster speed. The idea is that new games could be developed for that spec in mind and potentially have a much better looking new Spectrum game. All of that sounds great in theory, but the reason I never got one was just the price tag. It looks like now it's about £300 and it looks to be out of stock. So, my final thoughts about this. In case it wasn't already clear or you're just jumping around the chapters, I love this device. They nailed the form factor, the keyboard, and that is super important to me. The actual software is great because it's beginner friendly, but it has a lot of options for advanced Spectrum users. So who is this for? I think it's almost for everyone. Definitely for anyone curious about the ZX Spectrum. Even if you tried an emulator and it didn't quite click in, that might be because you were liking the real keyboard with all the keywords there. That makes it a lot more difficult. For those of you who already know that you like the ZX Spectrum, maybe you had one as a kid and you don't anymore, or maybe even like me, all your friends had one, this is a perfect way to experience that. Really, the only people who don't need one of these are people who already have one or more original ZX Spectrums and you already have all the accessories for them. In that case, it's convenient, but not necessary. I'm in that final category, and if I'm going to be totally honest with you, I will probably pull this out when I want to do something with a Spectrum instead of the original one, unless it's something to do with hardware or some very specific expansion. It's really that good. So seriously, go buy one right now before they run out. You'll thank me later.